Now let's start actually building out these three main components: our input, our display, and our role result display. If we look back to the finished project, we also might need to add some headings, some buttons throughout. We're basically just going to go top to bottom, implementing what we have so far, except just use static data for now instead of the data that the user will input at the end. So first thing we need to do is go back, and we need our nice header. For that, we want to do an H1, and we can just say we have our dice roller, and we can delete this other stuff, but maybe we can put a comment saying what else we're going to have. We are first going to have our dice input. We also need our roll button. Roll button. The way that I created that comment is you do either control or command and then backslash, like so. So roll button. We are also going to need our dice display, or I guess die display is the name of the component. Die display, and then we're going to need our bottom header is just going to, we'll use a H2, say roles, and then we will have our roles result. So if we look back, we've got dice roller, we're going to have the input, and then the roles. So let's start off just doing this input. We don't need to import or take in, for lack of a better word, any data. We're just going to have to create the inputs and create the button, and then later we will make it interactive. So first, we're going to wrap it in a div. Then you can give this a try yourself, or I will show you the solution in 1 second of how we can recreate just this top line. So first off is we need a label and a corresponding input. The input we want to give some kind of ID. So in this case, we can say name input, and then the label we will say is for that input. So we'll say HTML4 equals name input, and then say that we have a name. We want to say that this is explicitly of input type text. And then we can copy and paste this for our sides. Except instead of saying text, we need it to be a number. Lastly, we can add our button. The button is going to say add die, and we can check it out. There we go. It's a little messed up on the CSS, but don't worry about that. If you want to make the spacing a little bit nicer, all you need to do is add this global margin 2 points. So asterisk, curly brackets open, margin 2 pixels in app.css. Now there's a couple other finishing touches we want to add here. First off is we want to make sure that we have some kind of limit on the number of sides. So it doesn't make sense to have a negative number of sides on a die. And if you have a one-sided die, then that doesn't really do you any good. So what we can do is say min equals 2. And then this input will not let us go below 2. If you try to do like negative and you click out, it'll revert back to 2. We can also add a placeholder for a name to give you a little bit of just inspiration for what you might call your name. So we could say placeholder, sorry, that's not the label. We need on the actual input. placeholder equals, for example, D20 for like a D20 die. And there we go. The other thing, just to get ready for once we actually have some kind of action, is we can add our onClick event handler for the button. So we could say onClick, and then within this, we need to pass in a function. We can either do some specifically defined function, or most of the time, we just do an inline anonymous arrow function. So we can say alert added die, and then when we click on it, we just get a little browser alert, like so. If we look back over at our sort of completed dice roller, we can see that we have about a third of it done. We have our first die input created. Now we need our dice display, and then at the end, we're going to do our roll display. The dice display is going to be a little bit more complicated because it's not going to be static, right? No matter how many dice we have, no matter how many rolls we have, the dice input is going to look the same no matter what. There's just going to be one input. We can have some placeholder, but it's just going to be the same. For our dice display, we need to be able to pass some data into the display. You can imagine that if our data is stored at some other point in our application, we need to be able to pass in an array of dice to then display in the dice display. To do this in a React component, you have to pass what are called props. You've already done a little bit of work with props, even if you haven't necessarily fully realized it yet. For example, passing in the function to our onClick handler in our button is essentially passing a prop. It's just instead of passing it to a React component, we're passing it to a native HTML component. Same with our input, saying that it has to have a minimum value of 2. It's some property which either controls what the component displays or how it behaves. So how would we implement this for our next component, the die display? Let's start off by just creating a component. So export const die display equals some component. And for now, we can just say return just a little p tag that says display, like so, that. And then in our app.tsx, we can import it, import die display, and showcase the die display. So, right, we have our little display like so.